Hi, my name is Celine Figueroa, and I am a program specialist with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I'm so excited that you all are able to join us tonight for our sci-fi film series. As many of you know, this tradition has been ongoing for 10 years, and we're so glad that we're able to adapt it in a virtual way. So thank you all for doing your homework, watching the film, and joining us today. Today we have Dr. Piturro, as we're partnering with Denver Film, he is going to bring you the science behind your favorite sci-fi film. We also have our very own Naomi Paquette, excuse me, Naomi. And we're going to have a great conversation. I will actually just be watching the chat. So as you all have questions, go ahead and type them in that chat. I'll keep track of them, but I'll go ahead and pass the microphone over to Dr. Piturro, who'll get us started for this evening.
Okay, thanks, Celine. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Well, hello, everybody. It's really good to be with you. Of course, we hoped for our 10-year anniversary that we would have a really big show this year, but at least we could still bring you a few weeks of the series and continue the series on. And then we promise you that next year we'll have a really big show here at the museum and at the film center as well, just like we have been doing for the past 10 years up until now. So just very quickly about the program, obviously a little bit different than normally for the past 9 years. We've been coming to you live, introducing the film, speaking about the film a little bit, and then we'd screen the film and then we'd do the discussion afterwards. So we're kind of just skipping to that last part, the discussion now. And so I will give a brief introduction to the film, and I will kind of give you a few little questions to think about and perhaps try to answer as we move into the question and answer phase. So I'll do that brief introduction. Naomi will then give a brief introduction, and then we'll get to a question and answer session. And I am sure, just like we've done for the past 10 years, you're going to have wonderful, wonderful questions, and Naomi will have all the answers to them. And I may have a few answers as well. It's a really great film. I think it's an interesting film, and I think there's a lot to talk about with this film. So just a few things before we get going, a few notes. First of all, thanks to the museum and thanks to the Denver Film Society for hosting us, not just this year, but also for the past 10 years. The series came together about 11 years ago, actually. The idea for it came together about 11 years ago when my old friend and colleague, late Britt Withy from the from the Denver Film Society came to me and said, hey, I have this great idea. How about we pair films and science, and we talk about science fiction films, and I am applying for this big grant, and I think we're going to get this grant and we'll be able to, put on this series. And we went to the museum and then they were interested and it sounded great. And then we all got together and we all planned it, and then we didn't get the grant. But so we said, hey, we're going to do it anyway, and we'll see how it goes. So 10 years later, it's obviously gone quite well. And we're happy, really, really happy to be here with you. It took us a while to get here this year. We apologize for the delay, but we're glad we could bring something to you. I should also say that you should check out the Denver Film Society website, denverfilm.org. They have a new virtual platform, so you can still see movies that you would normally go to the C Film Center to see, but you can see those online. They have a new platform, so definitely check that out. Okay. One other note too before we get going, I think we mentioned to you last year, if you were around, that we're working on basically a book version of the film, book version of the series we've been doing for the past 10 years. And so that book is finished and is at the publisher and is going to come out pretty much any week now. We're really not positive exactly when it will come out, but everything's so crazy now. But it is available for pre-sale right now. And I think we're going to put the link up in the chat room for the book from McFarland Press. Just a little background of the book. It's basically 10 chapters, one film per chapter. And I co-wrote the entire book. I write half of each chapter. And then one of the scientists from the museum co-wrote the other half of the chapter. So I write about the film, they write about the science, all in one chapter. So there's 10 chapters. Naomi wrote one chapter. Dr. Kachun Yu, who we're going to see in week 3, wrote 3 chapters. Dr. Jeff Stevenson, who we're going to see next week with Gojira, he wrote a chapter. Let's see, Dr. Joe Surdich wrote a chapter on Jurassic Park, and Dr. Nicole Garno, who you know used to be at the museum, she wrote 3 chapters, and then Dr. Steve Lee wrote a chapter as well. And then a few of my colleagues from MSU Denver also contributed pieces to some of the chapters too. So it's chock full of great films, 10 films, basically what we've been doing for the past 10 years. And I should also note that all of us, the authors, have decided that all author proceeds will go to the food bank of the Rockies. So any proceeds that come to us will go directly to the food bank of the Rockies. So the pre-sale link will be up in the chat room. Hopefully you get a copy next year at the series. We're going to have some book signings too. So hang on to the book after you read it and bring it around next year. So that's all that stuff. So let's move on to tonight's program, to the film, and to our discussion for the night. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of science fiction. And one of the great things about these presentations, by the way, at home, is that my cats will make an entrance at any moment. They seem to think that I'm talking to them when I'm talking to the computer. So they like to come around. So if you see one of the cats, join in. They're huge sci-fi fans. And if you know Alien, you know, their favorite film is Alien, because, well, you know why. So anyway, so the history of sci-fi going back to, I'm going to start in the 50s and 60s because that's where our story of tonight starts. The 50s and 60s sci-fi films very much dealt with this kind of tension between science and humanism. And if you think about some of the great films from the 50s, for example, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Day the Earth Stood Still, right? There's this tension between science and humanism at that point. You know, the nuclear war, the atom bomb, that sort of stuff was hanging over everybody, right? So there was always this kind of push and pull between science and humanism at the time. It really kind of shows up in those 2 movies specifically. So Stanislaw Lem was a Polish science fiction writer, published the book Solaris in 1961. That was actually in Poland, he published in 1961. It took a while for it to sort of get to the Western world because you're talking about the Soviet bloc during this time. So it took everything a while to sort of get out of there. So Lem's book was written under that sort of idea, or that tension, right, between science and humanism. And you see that play out in the book version. And I don't know how many of you read the book version. Maybe you could tell us in the chat, say, yeah, you know, I read the book, and you know, here's what I think, etc. But that's where our story starts, excuse me, with Stanislaw Lem in the book version, 1961. Moving on to the 70s. The 70s in science fiction film was the sort of ideological age of science fiction. And what I mean by that is you have themes of environmentalism, for example, was a big theme in science fiction of the 70s. And if you think about those films from the 70s, like Soylent Green or Planet of the Apes or Silent Running, received that environmentalist theme run through it. So the first movie version of the book was by the great Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky in 1971. So the original movie version based on the book came out in 1971 from the Soviet Union. And so that movie was very much, it took some of the ideas from the book, but it changed it quite a bit, as movies tend to do, as they really have to do. And if you know the book, you probably wouldn't want to watch, I don't know, say 2-3 hours of scientists talking about the planet Solaris, the Solarists, and I think Naomi will talk a little bit about that. But the book was very much about a yearning for the earth, a communing with nature. Again, very much indebted to that whole environmentalist science fiction movement of the 70s. Now, again, the story kind of stayed somewhat similar, but a lot of things were changed. All right, moving on in science fiction cinema. In the 80s and 90s, you had a focus on emerging AI, and then you kind of moved into cyberpunk as well. So you have films such as Alien, late 70s, I guess, but Blade Runner, going into the 90s and the late 90s, The Matrix. And that's kind of sort of the end of what I see as the modern science fiction era. It sort of ends with The Matrix. And the reason I say that is for two reasons, actually. Number one, The Matrix kind of took everything that came before and then mixed it up in a blender. And every sci-fi idea since, Metropolis, going back to the 20s, was kind of thrown into The Matrix. And you really couldn't do much after that. What else can you do after The Matrix, right? The machines took over. We could kind of been leading up to that idea. There was this human versus machine idea in science fiction going back from 2001 Space Odyssey that kind of ends with The Matrix, right? The second reason is September 11th, which happened 2 years after The Matrix came out. And September 11th changed everything in our country. And for those of us who are around, we remember it. And I say that for those of us who are around because I probably have some students here who, weren't even alive yet then, perhaps, and or were just babies at that point. But September 11th changed everything. It changed the movies as well, and it specifically changed science fiction. Now, up until that point, we had seen a real sort of sense of the other in science fiction. The other might have been monsters. The other might have been aliens. The other might have been machines. And we always saw that other, something else we had to fight. Humans had to fight. At September 11th, that kind of came to a stop and it changed. The other, after September 11th, was us. So we became the other. We started looking more at ourselves, at we became more interiorized. And the science fiction films of the period post 9/11 reflected that. And if you think of some of the films I'm talking about, Children of Men, for example, which we've done in the series a few times. And actually, we have a chapter in the book on Children of Men, which is one of my favorites. You guys are all talking about your favorite films. Yeah, 2001 Space Odyssey, for sure, right? Is one of mine. But Children of Men is really one of my more recent favorite sci-fi films. But Children of Men, there's no aliens, there's no others. It's all us. It's immigration. What are we doing to each other, right? It's an environment. How are we degrading the environment, right? And it's all about us. Moon, great film, right? Monsters, even WALL-E, if you think about it, there's no other, right? The other is us in all of those films. And that whole trend started September 11th. The first film that I think started that trend is Solaris in 2002. Now, if you think about the film, and hopefully you just watched it, there's a scene right in the beginning there where Kelvin is moderating a panel, like a sort of group discussion, right? We don't get specifically what the panel's about. It's kind of a support group, but we get the sense that it is about September 11th, a September 11th support group. And so we get kind of a clue right there about the film, because even though it goes to outer space and it goes to this other planet, right? The planet doesn't really figure that much into the film insofar as the planet's the enemy, right? Because of what happens in the film and because of how the creatures, the 5 creatures I call them, the 5 creatures that show up, those 5 creatures, are projections of the character's subconscious. And so it's really, again, it's us that we're talking about. It's not an othering, right? The planet is sort of just facilitating it. So that's kind of the history of sci-fi, going back to the 50s and 60s, and then the three versions of Solaris: the book, the Tarkovsky version, and then this version, which I really, really like this version. But and I'm going to turn it over to Naomi in a second, but I want to talk about two things. Number one is a definition of science fiction. What is science fiction? And the author, Ted Chiang, who wrote the short story that the movie Arrival is based on, Ted Chiang described science fiction like this: science fiction is about using speculative scenarios as a lens to examine the human condition. And I think you could sort of make that argument for all of film, right? All movies. Science fiction is about using speculative scenarios as a lens to examine the human condition. Solaris certainly fits into that description. But let me add a question to that. And this is the question I'm going to ask you. I'm going to play professor here for a second. I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to talk about this. Every science fiction film that I teach, I always ask the class one question. And what does this film say about the question? What does it mean to be human? Right? What does it mean to be human? Every science fiction film has a way of answering that. And I really want to hear how you answer that question in terms of this film, in terms of Solaris. And I'd like to get to talk about that. And we can talk about any of your questions about the film, the action, the actors, the filming of it, the time period, anything you want to know about it, I could hopefully tell you about. And then Naomi is going to talk about science, the science in the film, science surrounding the film, and she'll answer those questions. So I will turn it over to my colleague from the Museum of Nature and Science, Naomi Piturro.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us here. Let's see if we can switch views here. Perfect. So my name is Naomi Piturro. I'm a space scientist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So this was a film that was right up my alley. There was lots of questions about space and about physics as well that came up. So I do have a few images because I think sometimes talking about big concepts in space, it's easier to see some images. So we're going to go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. All right, so the first thing I want to tackle is Solaris itself. So Vincent teased this a little bit, and hopefully my PowerPoint will show up here. Is we're introduced to this amazing planet called Solaris, and it's something that looks very different. We're introduced to it. It is very blue in color, at least in the 2002 version. You see these weird loops of material coming off of it. There's a dynamism about the planet itself. You see different colors, these brighter areas moving around, almost lava lamp-esque, and it's always illuminated. You never see a dark side of this planet. And so when I looked at it, I was really struck by the idea that this didn't look like a planet at all to me, but indeed looks more like a star. So on the left, we have Solaris. On the right, we have an image from the stereo telescope of our sun. Now, our sun, as you say, we'll probably say, is not blue, but we've taken an extreme ultraviolet image of our sun, and it really highlights the atmosphere, which is what Solaris reminded me of. So you can indeed see these loops of material coming off our sun, evocative of Solaris. And these are plasma charged particles that are extremely hot, following magnetic field lines, basically, that burst and send solar flares out. We see brighter areas of activity, darker areas, and it is a very dynamic and changing surface. And it would always be lit, having that nuclear fusion for its power source. Now, our sun is not blue, but there are blue stars out there. Our sun is a yellow, kind of average star, but there are these stars called blue supergiants that are about 25 times larger than our sun and 3 times as hot. So if you've ever seen the constellation Orion, there's a bright blue star called Rigel. That is a blue supergiant star that is very far away. And so these stars live fast and die young. They are extremely volatile stars. Because they are so big and so massive, they burn through their material very quickly. And this leads to a lot of problems. It can lead to more solar flares, more radiation, instability, and just activity on that star. So one of the things that the crew of the space station mentioned is they were sent there on a commercial mission. They wanted to be able to see if there was any commercial viability. Well, certainly you're not living on a star that is about 90,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but you also probably wouldn't be living on a planet close by either, because by the time a planet had time to form, even if it was the proper distance away to have liquid water to be an ocean planet, like is more described, I think, in the earlier versions of the film and of the book itself, you would have a star that's very unstable, that shoots a lot of flares off, that creates a lot of radioactivity and charged particles sending towards the planet. So probably not commercially viable, and certainly wouldn't want to be flying your spaceships through those loops. That could cause some problems. But the thing that really struck me was the interesting colors that we see in the planet itself. And if we are going under the idea of a star, we don't see any purple stars in our universe. This is a disappointment to me. It's my favorite color. So why is that? Well, a star's color is actually dependent on its temperature. So these blue stars, like I said, are extremely hot. They're big. And as we look at color temperature, we see a very small section of the electromagnetic spectrum. So we're looking at what we can see. We also have to consider what our eyes can actually perceive. And so it requires something very, very hot, hotter than we see in the universe, to truly peak into deep violet or ultraviolet. But even if it did, there's so many other colors being emitted that our eyes wouldn't be able to perceive it. So again, I'm bummed. The star is not going to be purple. But fun fact, our sun actually puts out most of its light in the green part of the spectrum, but it looks white to us because there's equal parts on the red side and the blue side being emitted. So no green stars either. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble. But one thing they did get right, assuming this is a blue supergiant star, we hear again from the scientists that once they turned on the Higgs device, it started gaining mass. Well, we're going to ignore that bit for a moment. But it starts to evolve, and as it evolves, it becomes redder. And this is exactly what we would expect from a blue supergiant towards the end of its life. So this diagram here looks at kind of stellar life cycles, if you will, of two different types of stars. On the left is the sun, is our sun, and other stars of similar size. But the right's what we're focused on. All stars form out of cloud of gas and dust. Something happens and it collapses, and it starts to gather mass until nuclear fusion starts. Well, these stars burn hydrogen, then they burn helium, and then they burn heavier and heavier and heavier elements. And they're in this battle between pressure pushing outwards from fusion and gravity wanting to pull them together. And eventually they lose that battle. So first they start running out of fuel, and they start to burn further out, and they puff up and they become these red supergiant stars. So this is indeed what we're seeing happening in Solaris. This is also what we're seeing happening with Betelgeuse. If you followed the news at all, everyone's getting really excited. Betelgeuse was dimming, and then it went back up, and now it's dimming again. So Supernova 2020, that's my campaign. Everyone root for Betelgeuse to go supernova because it'll be beautiful in the sky. And then that's what would happen. So they puff up these red supergiants, gravity wins, it collapses, and it causes this huge explosion that is very bright, we call supernova. And eventually it would leave behind a neutron star or black hole. So sorry, George Clooney, you don't have a long time there on Solaris. Or maybe we'll start a new movie and end up in Inception. Who knows? But the other thing that really grabbed me was the idea of particle physics. So we talk about the visitors, or these phi creatures, and they're described as being made of subatomic particles held together by a Higgs field. Okay, sounds like mumbo jumbo, but we can break it down. We're all made of subatomic particles, electrons, neutrons, protons, cool, but a Higgs field. Well, in 2002, this was actually pretty radical. We hadn't discovered a particle called the Higgs boson. That wasn't discovered for 10 more years at the Large Hadron Collider. And this image you see on your screen is actually simulation from a particle accelerator of what that collision would look like that we need to be able to detect the Higgs. And the Higgs boson is a mass carrier. It's what gives mass to everything in our universe. And so particle physics is weird. Things are particles. They're also waves. So it's also a field. So they have said 2 correct phrases so far. Check for them. But then they say they can be destroyed by creating a negative Higgs field and bombarding them with a stream of anti-Higgs bosons. Okay, so let's think about this. We know there are particles and there are antiparticles. But those are fermions, so things like electrons, right? Electron is the same as a positron, but they have different spins. You send them together to collide, they annihilate. All right, doesn't sound so bad. Well, bosons are force carriers, and there's no such thing as an anti-mass field. So we're starting to get towards the hand waving. And beyond that, they probably mean a graviton and gravitational field, because, you know, that's really what would hold a thing together, but we'll forgive them. So how do we create Higgs particles, antiparticles? Well, we use a particle accelerator, and we see a particle accelerator on the screen. It's a proton accelerator, and it's about yay big. This is an instrument from the Large Hadron Collider, which is the size of a particle accelerator we need to create a Higgs boson. And it straddles just by Geneva between Switzerland and France. It's massive. It's bigger than the spaceship. It's not fitting there. And that's because it just takes a bunch of energy. We use microwave light to excite these particles to spin them close to the speed of light to get them to collide. So right now, in technology-wise, we're probably not creating a particle accelerator to create antiparticles in a spaceship. But there's hope. There's research out there that we might be able to create a pocket-sized particle accelerator in the future using lasers. And that is as far as I was allowed to read in the paper before I hit a paywall. So I'm not going to be able to answer questions on that. But overall, I think Solaris presents some really interesting views of future science and where we might explore in different locations than we think of today. We are very solar system focused. We are very planet focused, but we might find something new. So with that, and thank you to Patrick, who likes my jokes. You're making my night. But with that, I think we can open it up to question and answer about anything on the science or the film that you have questions for us.
Fabulous. Thank you all. Yeah, so as Naomi said, we can go ahead and start with the Q&A portion. So please continue to send both your kudoses for Naomi's jokes, because I too appreciate them, and any questions about the film, about science fiction. You have 2 very brilliant, very awesome people here. We can get started with one of the questions that I saw a little bit earlier, and I think this one's directed to Dr. Piturro. Can you talk a little bit about the theme of mirrors and meeting an individual's mirrors? If we take that, that idea that science fiction is a lens to view ourselves, why are there literal lenses that are like reflecting them in this movie?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. Let me answer that a couple different ways. I'll talk about the actual mirrors in the film, but let me go a different way first. I saw, I think it was Nick wrote in the chat room about what does it mean to be human, and how the characters each reacted to. 4 characters, I guess, reacted to the mirrors of themselves. I don't like to think of the 5 creatures as mirrors. I think they are they're projections. They're projections of how we see people and how we see each other. So let's just take Kelvin and Rhea, for example. All right, so the 5 creature of Rhea that shows up, that is created by the planet, and I don't care what you say, by the way, Naomi, the planet can create 5 creatures. Okay, for a second I thought you were reading a script from Star Trek while you were doing your talk. but the planet does create the Phi creatures. But the Phi creatures are projections of how we saw that person. So it's not an actual projection of the person, it's a projection of how we saw the person, what we remember of the person. In Kelvin's case, Rhea shows up. She at first doesn't remember anything. She doesn't have any secrets because Kelvin didn't know her secrets. What she is what Kelvin remembers of her. And in fact, when it comes to the male-female idea, it's a very psychological film. Kelvin's a psychologist. The book is very much based in psychology as well. In Jungian psychology, the male projection of the female is called the anima projection. And the anima projection is basically how we think women see, or what men think women see, right? So in other words, it's how men think women are, which any male or female in the world will tell you, men don't have a clue, right? And that is obviously true, that, women are right. Of course, women are always right. But anyway, so that's the anima projection. And so basically it's how we saw those characters. So not necessarily mirrors, rather than they are ideas. They're the idea of the person that we have. All right. So that's the first thing I want to say about that. Now, the other thing about mirrors, the actual mirrors in any film is this idea that we're seeing a reflection of ourselves, but it's just a reflection, right? It's simulacra. It's a copy of something that doesn't exist really, because the reflection is just a reflection of something. It's not a reflection of who we are, right? So it's a very superficial idea of the person. And we can go into very different strand of Jungian psychology there, but that will take like 3.5 hours. That's the lecture I usually do on Jungian readings of films. But the idea of mirrors in films is, that idea that it's a reflection of something that doesn't really exist. And if you think about it, the Phi creatures are exactly that, right? They're just, they're simulacra. They're copies of something that never really existed, because it only exists in the person's mind.
And I'm just going to jump in with that. That was something from personal experience that really struck me because, I have lost both my parents relatively recently. And this was a really interesting exploration of grief, and something that we talk a lot about in that psychology of grief is this idea that you create a person of that loved one based on your memories. And I really loved how that we're able to play with that in the sci-fi film, that reflection, in a safer way of saying, well, but are we seeing that whole person, or what are we selecting? What are we not selecting? And that idea of that person not being real. And so that was something, from that psychological perspective that is really interesting, that it explores and certainly goes into with Kelvin. And that idea of what is real, and what stories do we tell?
Yeah. And how do we bridge that gap? Right? Yeah. How do we bridge the gap between what is real, what is our idea, and what is the reality of the person? What is that person really like? Do we ever really know anybody? Right?
Right. Yeah.
Celine, do you have anything else there?
I do. So even thinking about that idea, why do you all think, and I'd love to hear both of your opinions on this. And I'm going back to that question that you asked, Dr. Piturro, about like what it is to be human, and why sci-fi tends to be the way in which we examine what it is to be human. Is there something about it being unreal, or it being in a science way, like in a science theme? Or why do you all think that sci-fi is that realm? What makes sci-fi so unique and such a great way to put a mirror to what we're doing, or to observe what it is that humans are doing? And I'll extend that beyond even this film. Think of Black Mirror on Netflix, or other shows or movies, that this is a recurring theme in the genre.
Yeah, well, let me say that science fiction is a great way to explore so many different things because it allows us distance. It allows us some distance between us and the idea or the theme, for example. So science fiction, many years ago, like, okay, before the Matrix, before September 11th, science fiction was always set usually in a faraway future. Right? The Matrix is set thousands of years or whatever it is. I don't know. Somebody will give me the exact time frame. But science fiction set in the faraway future allows us a safe distance with which to view that thing, whatever that thing is, whether it be environmental degradation, whether it be interstellar travel, whatever that might be. Whether it's an alien invasion or how we react to aliens, it gives us that safe distance so that we can say, okay, we don't have to deal with that now. That's far away, right, in the future, right? When it comes to the question of what does it mean to be human, science fiction film does that same thing. Mm-hmm. Right? It gives us some distance away from our humanity, right, to look at that and explore that, right, to look at it outside of ourselves. Right? This Solaris is a great example because it goes to another planet, travels to this other place. Right? So it's physical distance in that film. So I think sci-fi is a great way of looking at that question. What does it mean to be human? In the more recent science fiction, that what does it mean to be human looks at us, looks at humans and how we treat each other, how we treat the planet, how we deal with issues like immigration, how we deal with issues of cloning, of gene splicing, of all those kinds of things. And our attitudes towards those things, right, tell us about ourselves and tell us what it means to be human. And that's why Children Men does that really well. You go back and watch Children Men, by the way. I know I talk about it a lot. Sorry about that. I'll talk about it a lot for a while. But go back and watch it from, I don't know how old it is, 15 years old now, something like that. But think about how prescient that film was when it came out and how our world looks a lot like that today. So Naomi, do you have any ideas on that?
I think space-based sci-fi does that especially well, like you said, because it's not only far off in the future, but there's a physical distance there. And it is such, I think of this 1960s Star Trek, these absolutely absurd premises, right? Why would someone with one half of their face being white, one half being black, and the other being reversed not get along? But that seems so superficial and so physically and, time distant.
Wait a second. Are you saying Star Trek is ridiculous? Are you saying that, Naomi? You're not really saying.
I mean, I have the USS Enterprise right here. I still love it, but at moments, yes. Live long and prosper. It's fine. But yeah, it is something that it doesn't hit us quite as much as a ton of bricks as it was if you're sitting down and watching a documentary like I have been of racial equality in America, right? It is easier to sit down and have enjoyment and those thoughts provoked when it does seem itself other to us, even if it does have those reflections.
And somebody in the comments actually mentioned that they had watched the film when it first came out in 2002 and then watched it again today, and they got two very different readings from it. What do you all think about even just time distance with it having been released so close to 9/11 and what our country was going through at that time? What do you all think that, like, now watching the film 20 years later, have your readings been different?
Yeah, I think so. I think we always look at film through a lens of where we are, where we are now. And, we can look at a film like 2001 Space Odyssey in 1968. We could see something very differently from how we see it now, and we can sort of extrapolate onto the film our own projections, our own desires, our own fears, our own wants, what's going on in our world at the time. some theories about film talk about the film screen as, like a dreamscape, right? It's a screen upon which we project our subconscious fears, desires, thoughts, etc. So I think it's always really kind of where we are. So it's really cool to understand the genesis of the film when it was, when it came out. When I saw it when it came out, it was really emotional for me. I think it's a really emotional film in so many ways, but it was more emotional because I saw it in 2002, 1 year after 2001, when emotions were raw, and it was an emotional time. I look back at it now and I see some different things. Yeah. I see this idea of trying to find some common ground, with people, trying to find some common ground with the idea of a person, who a person is. And I don't just mean that in an interpersonal way, but also in a sociological view of that as well. Finding common ground with your ideas of what people are and who they really are. And that, I see something very different today. So I think that's a wonderful way to look at and think about movies.
And I have only seen this once. So I obviously was bringing very personal recent experiences to it as I watched this film, along with that scientific eye to sit there and pause and go, what was that star doing? What 160 gigahertz does what? No. So I don't have that chance of reflection, but certainly with literature and with film, anything, it really does allow you to bring your experiences, and it will be different every time.
And as a scientist, Naomi, what are your, I have two questions for you. One is like, what are your thoughts about science being the medium for this? It's really interesting working in the Science Museum and knowing that science is a lot of guessing, testing, hypothesizing, and then coming up with a conclusion based on that. What do you think of science being projected as this like end all be all solution in science fiction for a lot of problems that are humanistic in nature?
That's a hard one. And I think, we certainly have seen that the science is a process, and that's not something that is always understood, because a lot of times it is portrayed so definitively. And the fact that we see science changing and adapting with new information, new evidence, is something that is really strong. Certainly our world has changed in the past several hundred years of where science comes from and the information it can provide and how much more visible and accepted it is. Certainly it can provide a lot of answers, and it can help better society. But there is something that is the humanist side that a scientist brings. We're not robots. We are not Vulcan. I'm just going to keep throwing the Star Trek references. I know. You've worked with me for 4 years, Vincent. You should know I have some emotions. And so we do bring a humanistic side to our science. And I think science fiction at times can be that beautiful blend, even though it shows it as such stark contrast and as opposing ideas at moments. But that is something that is blended. And if you really watch sci-fi from that perspective, you start to see it a bit more of that. While I saw in the comments, someone was talking about the scientists being a bit more distant, right? But they bring a lot to that work, and a lot of themselves to that work. And I think we certainly see that with Dr. Klein. Or
Absolutely.
Kelvin, sorry, Klein. So I'm like reading a note on the side.
Absolutely. And there was a question in the chat directed at Naomi, but I'm going to open it up to both of you, about the way, has anything in space science made you think about yourselves in the way that that science fiction or this movie does? So has anything made you be like, oh, wow, that's a lot, and made you feel really, really human in the moment? That's a tough question, I know.
I think for me, honestly, some of the things we're exploring with our new space science gallery that we're redoing Space Odyssey. It's going to open in November. And one of the things that was really important to us was to honor all of the ways of knowing in science, right? And so that starts with that sense of wonder and awe of looking up in the night sky and making meaning. And I think looking back, we worked very closely with the Coche di Pueblo, with the Pawnee, to get their stories of the sky and how they made meaning of that and present that respectfully and in the same weight as we did other more modern scientific experiments, but also showing they're careful observers. We've done this for thousands of years. And we can see that reflected in architecture around the world where people have been aligning buildings to the sky. I mean, the Maya did cool stuff to use astronomy for power, right? Of these cool tricks of light that require immense science for a very humanistic purpose that's related to space. And I think for me, that was an interesting recalibration, because we can make scientists and science so cold and concrete and othered, that really did bring that human story back into that thread for me of really looking at that history of science and how much it is part of our humanity. But a lot of the time I spend time going, we're just tiny. Every exoplanet we discover, every Earth-like planet, every major discovery, I'm like, oof, we're tiny, we're cool. We have an amazing humanity, but we're so small in this universe. So it was nice to shift that perspective.
Yeah, I can address that a little bit too. Just for one, you know, really on a simple level. I mean, what is it, Naomi? What's the figure? How much of the universe do we know? Is it what, 5% or something like that is known to us? Something like that. So that figure is both sort of awe-inspiring and comforting at the same time. So there's so much that we don't know. There's so much that we're never going to know, that that's sort of comforting in terms of, you know, struggling with life, right? Struggling with going through life and thinking, okay, you know, there's so much I don't know out there, and, you know, I'm not going to be able to fix all those things and, you know, come up with conclusions, you know, for all those things. So that's sort of one thing. The other thing about, and I'll go to science fiction film, as that's my area, is that science fiction film makes you think, right? It makes you think about the big questions and the small questions. It makes you go from, you know, to either end. It makes you think about the big questions, like, what does it mean to be human? Right? When you watch a film like Solaris, you take a step back, you're like, oh yeah, we don't really know people. We don't know other people. How do we get to know them? Right? So it makes you ask those big questions, and then it brings it down to a very simple human level. How can I get along with this person? How can I get to know this person? How can I come to know X, Y, or Z? Right? Because that goes not just for people, but it goes for things as well. So that's what I really like about science fiction film, is that it starts with the big questions and it really ends up with you, right, as a personal question. I will go back to when you were talking about science and film, though, Naomi, for a second. Science and film, and, you know, what does that mean, and all that sort of stuff. And everybody who knows me and has been in the series over the past 10 years, you probably know the story. I'll make it brief. When he was making Alien, you know, Ridley Scott in the beginning thought, I'm going to make this really, you know, scientific, and I'm going to be like Stanley Kubrick, and it's all going to be scientifically accurate, and everything's going to be perfect. And, you know, he had a scientist following around the whole movie and telling him, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to do this, you have to do that. And finally, you know, Ridley Scott said to the scientists, bugger off. It's a movie, bugger off. And so, you know, when it comes right down to it, you know, it's a movie, right? And scientists, you know, Naomi, bugger off. Star Trek is not crazy, okay?
But I think too, you know, there is a point of scientific accuracy, but it's a point of taking a nugget and running with it, right? Because we want to explore not what we know right now, and we know science will never stop learning and growing. And so we want to imagine what's next. And that requires taking a step away from the current science and throwing in some quality technobabble. I love some good technobabble that just makes no sense, but sounds fantastic. And that, for scientists, is really inspiring as well. I mean, I remember watching Contact as a kid, knowing we have no technology to get to another planet. We have the tech to maybe get a signal, right? But that was so inspiring to figure out, how do we do that? What's the next discovery? And start questioning what's out there. And so I like it when sci-fi takes a nugget of science and runs with it. And just, if it's totally scientifically accurate, it can be great. I mean, The Martian was probably one of the closest films I've seen recently that does that, although he admits he starts it off with everything wrong. Windstorm's not going to happen. But I think the ones that are really, truly inspiring do say, Okay, we've got enough from you. Go away now to the scientist. We're going to run with it and run with our imagination.
And speaking of Star Trek, because we're talking about so much, we've talked for a while about adding Star Trek to this series. We haven't done that yet, but maybe we'll talk about that for next year.
That'd be great.
Adding some Star Trek in. So there you go. There's another topic for the chat room there. Would you like to see Star Trek in the series next year? And if so, what? An episode, a movie? You tell us.
Yeah.
Excellent. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to throw, I've been seeing this theme show up in the chat for a little bit, and it's a little bit of a longer question. So I'm hoping that we have time to give it at least a small answer. One of the things that we see recurringly in science fiction, and even in the way that we've talked about this, and some of the folks in the chat have talked about this, is this idea of spirituality and religion being explored through science fiction. I'm curious, from both the scientist and the film perspective, what do you think brings that about? Is it just that idea of exploring the unknown from that faraway lens that we were talking about? Is it, because it's very reminiscent of the way that folks used to look at space before we knew anything else. So are we making a full circle? What's going on?
Yeah, big question to say the least, Celine. Yeah, let's figure out religion, science, and everything all in what, 2 or 3 minutes? Sure, no problem. Go ahead, Naomi. Go ahead and do it.
I was going to say, you can start, Vincent. It's fine.
Yeah. No, let me just say really quickly, though, that science fiction is really sort of an interesting avenue to explore religion because you kind of start from the same place with both, right? Science and religion, almost, in terms of you're in a search for knowledge, a search for knowing, a search for something, right? How you get there might be different. And in science, you want concrete answers to come through. But that search for knowledge, that quest for knowledge, science fiction is a great genre, a great avenue to explore that. And there's a reading of a critical reading of this of Solaris that says you can look at the planet itself as sort of a godlike figure, where it's sort of indifferent. It creates the Phi creatures, but then leaves them be. It doesn't interfere with them, right? So in one sense, you could look at Solaris as a godlike figure, and there is some spirituality there, right? What is that person that that Rhea comes to life, if you will, with an immediate existential crisis. Who am I, right? That the crisis that we all have in our lives at some point, right? So, in the middle of this sci-fi, great sci-fi story, there's a real sort of religious tone to it. Very, very Kierkegaard. If you know Kierkegaard at all, I've read Kierkegaard at all, religious existentialism. And yeah, Celine, we can't do Kierkegaard in 2 minutes. So I'm going to leave the rest for you, Naomi.
And I would say both, fundamentally our quest to know more and to understand what's around us. I think science and religion ask different questions. Religion asks why, we as scientists ask how. And they're not things that, they don't have to be at odds with one another. They can coexist. And that is ultimately that goal of that search for knowledge, which is really important. And I think, as humans, there is a side to us that is always going to want to make meaning of something and find that meaning that spirituality and that science fiction can create. I love your cat, Vincent. And, we're going to see both continue to explore in different ways as we move forward in the future. And as we tell these human stories, and these two questions are going to keep coexisting.
Absolutely. We've got about 5 minutes left. We have a question from Patrick to Vincent, and I'll again extend the question to both of you in different realms. Vincent, do you have any suggestions for how to become a better sci-fi or film viewer? Naomi, do you have any suggestions on how to become a better science or science reader, experiencer, scientist?
Yeah, I can start, Celine. take my class. I teach a class every summer at MSU Denver. It's a completely online class, and not just in the middle of the pandemic either. It's always online every year. Science fiction cinema, where we do kind of a chronological study of sci-fi from Metropolis in the 20s right up until present. So that's one. The better way is, and I'll give a book plug here, is to get the book and read the book. So the book goes through 10 films. We walk through the art of the film. I do an analysis, a very close analysis of each of the 10 films. And then the scientist does a scientific study of those films as well. So, the book is actually exactly, the reason why we wrote the book is to answer your question. Is, how can I look at sci-fi a little more in depth than, hey, there's aliens. And there's technobabble, so that's why we wrote the book. And so I would suggest that. Again, the link for the book is in the chat, right? Your turn, Naomi.
I guess my answer would be to stay curious for both, whether it's science or science fiction, because it's going to lead you on an amazing exploration, and to have that open mind when you see an alien of like, okay, why do all the aliens look humanoid, right? And so you get that amazing exploration of the art and the makeup and the props and how that evolution happens. But then you can also go the scientific way and explore, well, why would a alien look humanoid? What conditions do we have here that might be different from underneath Europa that gets the cool bioluminescent squid monster? What might that look like? And that curiosity can lead you down so many facets. I mean, when I'm watching these films for the series, I'm sitting there, I know to watch for the science, but these questions pop up. I have a whole section in my notes of like, oh, how does this film determine what's human, and about retrofuturism. And it is just that curiosity of asking, oh, why did they make the spaceship look that way? Or, oh, well, that's rotating. Is that accurate? Could we actually do that? And that will lead you down, I think, as a great science reader, a great scientist, a great artist, and a better viewer or reader of science fiction.
I think those are both fantastic answers. And at DMNFs, we continue to say, stay curious. So I love that you're able to incorporate that. We have about 3 minutes left. Is there any parting wisdom that you all would like to impart before we have to say goodbye?
Yeah, Naomi, did you want to start, or I could start? Whichever you'd like.
It.
Okay, yeah. First, let me just give out my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. You can find me on the MSU Denver website easily. My email is vpiturro@msudenver.edu. vpiturro@msudenver.edu. I also write a film review column every month for a local paper called The Front Porch. You can find that online. If you live in Stapleton, Park Hill, you can see the actual paper copy. So I write film reviews every month. Follow me on Twitter. I only do events, talk about events I'm doing or other film events in Denver and the area, or I'll tweet out reviews or links to my monthly review column. If you just want to ask a question that you didn't get in tonight or didn't want to ask in the chat room, or comes up later and say, hey, Dr. Piturro, I was thinking about this in the film, email me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. I love to talk film, and I'm happy to do that with you. And any students out there that are there tonight, also send me a message and let me know you were here tonight. So I'll say thank you, and thanks for coming, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you next week with Jeff Stevenson for Gojira, the original Godzilla from Japan. Naomi, it's all yours.
I would just say thank you all so much for joining us. I look forward to this every year. This is one of my favorite parts of my job, where I get to put on a little bit different hat than I normally wear at the museum. And I would say, if you want to explore science and science fiction, come check us out. Back in November, Space Odyssey is going to be open. We expanded our gallery. We have a fantasy spaceship now. So the scientists have embraced the science fiction. We have a bridge you can sit on and a captain's chair. You can jump to light speed, in addition to exploring some really amazing other features like our Mars diorama and some brand new exhibits. So that's still on track despite COVID. So please come check that out. And hopefully we'll see you back here next week and next year for more of this film series.
Thank you both. Thank you to Dr. Piturro and our very own Naomi Paquette for joining us tonight. Thank you to our fabulous audience members. You had great insights. We hope that we will see you all next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that. And those are the films that we'll be showing. But thank you all again. We hope to see you all soon.